Continuing the story, chapter 3, a lot of you raised your hand, but if you haven't read it, read it. It's really an awesome way of how they compiled the Bible's scriptures into a nice way of reading it. And if you're just jumping into this, we still have copies of the story out there at the Welcome Center. If you want to see someone after church, pick one of those up. That'd be great. We're going through the story, trying to understand our place in God's story. And chapter 3 was all about Joseph. And his story takes up a lot of real estate in Genesis. His story starts in chapter 37 and goes to the very end of Genesis. So we're going to be studying his story and where he begins with his dream, but then experiences just a lot of disappointments in life. How many are familiar with the child book series, Choose Your Own Adventure books? And those, yeah, I see someone did. Beth. Well, I grew up with those books, and they were very popular, and I guess they sold like 250 million copies of those books. But in case you don't know what those books were or how they worked, what you did is you read the story, and as you're reading, you get to a point where you have to make a decision. And based on your decision, it told you what page to go to next. And so you're going to page 97 for the next stage of the story. And you basically get to pick your story and how your story ended. And there's several different endings you could end up on. And it was always fun to go back and forth and say, okay, what if I pick this way and go this way? And it was always great. Typically, it was major plot points where you got to pick, or a major situation that was happening. 250 million copies. That's pretty popular. But there's a reason this is a children's book series, right? Because as adults, we know it's not really how life works. You don't get to choose your own adventures. The concept is definitely appealing as adults. But somehow we determine our own destiny, choose our own circumstances to avoid adversity, to stay away from disappointments in life. Boy, I would love that, right? I'm just going to skip this and go to the next page. As kids, you might believe that really it's all in my hands and I'm in control. And I can do whatever I want to do and be whatever I want to be, and life can go whatever direction I want it to go. But as adults, that's just not how life works. Life is not a choose your own adventure book. Or I could put it this way. All of us start off thinking our story will be written a certain way, but never quite goes how we planned it. All of us start off with certain dreams, but reality has a way of waking you up. That is what we see here when we study Joseph's life. Joseph, he's the son of Jacob, Israel. He's the grandson of Isaac, great-grandson of Abraham. So in Genesis 37, we'll begin Joseph's story. Joseph, he's a teenager at this point in his life, and he's kind of grown up in a dysfunctional household. Okay, that might be a big understatement. Here's what we find. He is his father's favorite. He's got 10 older brothers, but Jacob loves him most. He gives Joseph a really nice coat, a lot you know as the coat of many colors. But it's not just any coat that he's been given by his father. By giving Joseph this coat, Jacob is saying, Joseph is going to run things eventually. He's the one I'm choosing to be my heir for the family. He's going to get the main share of the inheritance. So his father gives him this coat. Okay, let me put it this way. It would be like on Christmas. Say you have 11 sons. That's a lot of sons. And you give them 10, you give 10 of them a bouncy ball. Now, I don't want to put down bouncy balls because I really enjoy them, okay? But you give 10 of them bouncy balls, but you give one of them an iPad. That's going to be problematic in the relationships between the brothers, right? And that's what happens here. Here's what we read in Genesis 37:4. It says, when his brothers saw that their father loved him more than any of them, they hated him. They hated Joseph. And and could not speak a kind word to him. Some of you know how quickly you don't get to choose your own adventure. You didn't get to choose your own family. Instead of a house filled with love, you have a house filled with hate. And like Joseph, you grew up where no one seemed capable of speaking a kind word. A house full of criticism, negativity, harsh tones, a dysfunctional family. Joseph has 3 stepmoms living under the same house. Sounds like a bad reality TV show. 3 stepmoms, 1 house. But that's where he's growing up. Homes like this have a way of crushing dreams. So, with all this going on, Joseph decides not to help matters. He has a dream as a teenager, and he decides to share it with his brothers. And this dream is of him and his brothers all bowing down to him. Okay, so he gets this coat saying he's going to be the heir to the family, and he says, you're all going to bow down to me. I had this dream. It's great, guys. Look at this dream. It's awesome. Okay, so if you're taking notes, and please do, if you are a younger sibling, you might want to write this down. Should you have a dream that all your older siblings are going to bow down to you, you might want to keep it to yourself. You don't need to share it out loud at the breakfast table over Lucky Charms. Joseph had this dream, and he's like, guess what, guys? Guess what I dreamed about last night? And then the brothers, well, they grow to hate him even more. And then one day, the brothers are out working hard. Brothers are manual labor work with the sheep and the goats, and they're out in the fields. And well, Joseph is not. He's back in the main compound, taking life easy. But his dad says, hey, they might need some water and some food. So he sends Joseph to see his brothers and take them some food and water. Joseph comes strolling up. He's wearing his nice robes, nice coat of many colors. They see him coming. And here's what they say to each other. Look at verse 19. Here comes that dreamer. You can just kind of hear it in their voice, right? Here comes that dreamer. Come now, let's kill him and throw him into one of these cisterns and say that a ferocious animal devoured him. Then we'll see what comes of his dreams. Let's kill him. Judah, one of Leah's boys, speaks up in verse 26. Judah said to his brothers, what will we gain if we kill our brother and cover up his blood? Come, let's sell him to the Ishmaelites and not lay our hands on him. After all, he is our brother, our own flesh and blood. Let's not kill him. Let's just sell him into slavery. That way we can get some money out of this situation. And that's what they do. They sell Joseph into slavery. At age 17, Joseph is taken as a slave to Egypt. He's sold to one of Pharaoh's officials, a man named Potiphar, who was the captain of Pharaoh's bodyguard. The brothers cover up what they had done by taking the coat of many colors. They killed a goat. They dipped the coat in the blood and gave it to Jacob. When Jacob sees this, he assumes his son has been killed, and he grieves, and it breaks him. But all the while, Joseph is back in Egypt, serving as a slave for Potiphar. But Potiphar sees something special in Joseph. He sees a young man with rare leadership abilities and gifts. It doesn't take long, and Potiphar has Joseph in charge of his whole house. In fact, the Bible even says that with Joseph in charge, Potiphar didn't concern himself with anything. He gives Joseph the keys to his life. So even though he's a slave, he's kind of worked himself up as much as a slave can. And then the story kind of takes a desperate housewife's turn. Here's what we read. Potiphar's wife, who would have likely been a very attractive, beautiful Egyptian woman, based on Potiphar's position in the cabinet of the Pharaoh. Well, she becomes infatuated with Joseph. The Bible says Joseph is a very handsome, well-built young man. So she makes him her pursuit. And it gets graphic. She says to him, "Come to bed with me." I know, that's the PG translation. But in Hebrew, back in this time, that was very crass to say something like that and to have it written down like that. And here's how Joseph responds to her, though, in verse 9. He says, "How then could I do such a wicked thing and sin against God?" And the Bible says that though she spoke to Joseph day after day, he refused to go to bed with her or even be with her. He wouldn't even be with her, near her. So here's what we see for Joseph as we look at his story. It's been a lot of disappointment so far. He had these dreams. Things seemingly were good. Now he's a slave. Lots of disappointment. But in the midst of the disappointment, he is still faithful to God. What happens to many of us when disappointment comes? We tend to have a way of allowing disappointment to justify our disobedience. We often respond to disappointment by justifying disobedience. Have you ever noticed this in your life? Disappointment can justify disobedience. We say, well, God doesn't seem to be holding up his end of the deal. I mean, after all, look where I'm at. This wasn't how my story was supposed to unfold. And because God has seemingly let me down over here, then I'm going to do what I want over here. Disappointment can justify disobedience. And I think that's especially true with sexual sin. In the context of Joseph's story, that's where the temptation is. And I think it's still true today. This disappointment can justify disobedience, especially in the area of sexual sin. So as I know some of you are single, and you thought by now you would have found someone special, that someone special, by now God would have connected you to the right person. And you've tried to follow God's standard. You said, look, I'm committed to doing things God's way, but let's be honest. The longer he takes, the more tempting it is to lower your standard. The more disappointed you become, the more easily you find yourself justifying the disobedience. I heard about a pastor who was talking to a friend that was single, and he was telling his friend about a survey he had read about Christian singles, where they asked the Christian singles what the number one temptation that they struggled with. And 90% of these Christian singles said sexual sin. And his friend turns to him and goes, well, I know what the other 10% struggle with. And the pastor goes, what's that? Lying. And I think there's this tendency to feel like, okay, God, if you're not going to come through for me in this area of my life, that means it's okay to do what I want to do. And not do the things you want to do. It's not just true for those who are single, though. For those who are married also. The only thing worse about being disappointed and single is being disappointed and married, right? Let me put it this way. The only thing worse than being alone is wishing you were. And so this happens in marriages where a wife doesn't remember the last time she felt loved by her husband, listened to, or honored by her husband. And so somehow feels it's okay then to flirt at the office or reconnect with an old boyfriend online. Or a husband who is married to his wife and she makes intimacy sound like a chore that's somewhere between doing the dishes and folding the laundry. And so he justifies logging onto the website because he's got needs. And so we, in our moments of disappointment, have a tendency to justify our disobedience. Listen, Joseph's story is not going how he thought it would. The plot is not unfolding how he imagined, but he is still faithful to God in the midst of the disappointments. Joseph says to Potiphar's wife, how could I do such a thing and sin against God? Well, how could God do such a thing to Joseph? He's had these dreams, then he's sold into slavery by his brothers. His dad thinks he's dead. He's serving as a slave with no rights. He'll never be married. slaves didn't get to marry. Yet Joseph is faithful in the midst of all these disappointments. One day, Potiphar's wife takes things to another level. Once again, she comes to him and says, "Come to bed with me." This time, she grabs him by the cloak. She pulls. He slips it off and runs away. She's left there holding his coat, and she cries, "Rape." Security comes. She has his coat. Potiphar's wife then has Joseph thrown. No, Potiphar has Joseph thrown into prison. Here's what's interesting, though, about this. Potiphar, he's the captain of Pharaoh's bodyguard. Now, this would have been translated, as bodyguard would have been translated into executioner. So her husband, Potiphar, was the chief executioner for Pharaoh. One of his favorite ways to execute people at that time would have had to have been burying people alive. That doesn't sound very fun. He was not a person who would just have thrown a slave into prison. He would have killed them. Except for that, what we can safely presume is he trusted Joseph more than he trusted his wife. Joseph is thrown into prison. Potiphar saves face because his wife made accusations. But then Joseph spends the next 10 years in prison. Now, prison at this time it's a dungeon. I mean, let's just be honest. It is what it is. It's a hole where he's chained, at least initially. As he has done nothing to deserve this, he's in this dungeon. As we studied the story, we'll see more examples of people who make decisions like that they don't deserve what happens to them. They don't deserve what leads to this disappointment. And Joseph did not deserve this disappointment. With Adam and Eve, when they bit the fruit, we see this with Abraham and Sarah when they bring Hagar into their marriage. Their own decisions bring about a lot of heartbreak and disappointment. But that's not the case here. Joseph has done nothing to deserve this. It wasn't his sin. It wasn't his disobedience. It wasn't his rebellion. It wasn't his unfaithfulness. But there was a lot of disappointment in his story. It wasn't his fault. It was just life. He was a victim of someone else's decision and choices. He started off with a dream and became a slave. What's worse than being a slave? Being a prisoner. And that's what has happened here. And so here is the question as we reach this point in the story. Where is God in the midst of such disappointment? 13 years. Where is God in the midst of this disappointment? Some of you are in a chapter of your story, your personal story right now, and this is the question you're asking. Where is God in the midst of my disappointment? To the man who is on his third round of chemo after losing his wife to cancer just a few years before, where is God in the midst of the disappointment? To the woman whose husband left her for another woman while she's pregnant with their first child, where is God in the midst of her disappointment? To the teen girl who grew up being abused and now struggles with cutting. To the single mom who takes care of her 16-year-old girl who was paralyzed when hit by a drunk driver. Where is God in the midst of her disappointment? Or maybe even a better word, in the midst of their devastation. Where is God when you're in the dungeon? If you look at chapter 39, here's what you find. A couple of reminders that we are given of where God is at. Chapter 39:2. This is when Joseph is a slave, and here's what it reads, very simply. The Lord was with Joseph. Look down towards the end of the chapter at verse 23. In prison now, he's a prisoner. This time, what does it say? It says exactly the same thing as it said when he was a slave. The Lord was with Joseph. The Lord was with Joseph. It doesn't seem like it. He's in a hole. But he's there. Amen. The warden soon sees in Joseph what Potiphar saw. The warden puts Joseph in charge of the entire prison. 2 prisoners under Joseph, the cupbearer to Pharaoh and the baker, both in prison, both have explicit dreams. But they're more than just dreams. They mean something and they both know it. So they start sharing these dreams with Joseph. God gives Joseph the interpretation of the dreams, and he shares it with the cupbearer and the baker. The dreams both end up coming out exactly as Joseph said. You read the story and you think, okay, well, that's interesting. But here's what happens. A couple years later, the cupbearer is out of prison. Pharaoh wakes up one morning and has a very disturbing dream. He knows it means something, but what does it mean? So he gathers his counselors and asks them. Nothing. He gathers the wise men of Egypt. Nothing. No one really knows what the dream meant. But the cupbearer off to the side goes, oh yeah, wait a second. I know this guy named Joseph. He's in prison, but he can tell you what your dream means. Pharaoh calls for Joseph and tells Joseph his dream. The Bible tells us God gives Joseph the interpretation for the dream, and Pharaoh knows it's from God. Chapter 41, 38 through 41. So Pharaoh asks them, can we find anyone like this man, one in whom is the Spirit of God? Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, since God has made all this known to you, there is no one so discerning and wise as you. You shall be in charge of my palace, and all my people are to submit to your orders. Only with respect to the throne will I be greater than you. You're going to be the second most powerful man in Egypt, in the world. And so Pharaoh said to Joseph, I hereby put you in charge of the whole land of Egypt. What? Wait a second. He was just a prisoner. He was just a slave. Now he's the deputy Pharaoh, second most powerful man in the world. How does this happen? It's because God is writing the story, not us. We saw this last week. God wanted to populate a nation, so what does he do? He goes, let's go with the elderly, infertile couple. Now the time has come for God to rescue his people from a famine that's coming. He needs one of his people in a position of power and authority. So who does he choose? A former slave, ex-con, Joseph, at 30 years old. Now look at the story. I don't know a faster way for him to have made deputy Pharaoh than what he had to go through. We see once again that when God writes his story, he chooses the most unlikely cast. That's right. God uses Joseph to execute his plan that saves millions of people from severe famine. It was a 7-year famine. It doesn't just affect Egypt, it spreads to the outer regions. Eventually, Canaan, which is where Joseph's family is from, is affected. Now, Joseph's family has money, but there's no food to buy with the money. So here's what happens. Jacob sends his older brothers, Joseph's older brothers, to Egypt to buy grain. They had heard that Egypt has stockpiled grain. So Joseph's brothers arrive. 22 years since they sold Joseph into slavery. He was 17 at that point. He's 39 now. They don't recognize him. They find themselves in front of the deputy Pharaoh, not knowing who he was. And they bowed down to him. 22 years in the making. Joseph puts them through a test. He wants to make sure they've changed, that they see that they are sorry. He sees that they are now compassionate towards his father. He gets to a point where he can't even hold it in. He cries out in chapter 45, 1 through 5. It says, then Joseph could no longer control himself before all his attendants, and he cried out, have everyone leave my presence. So there was no one with Joseph when he made himself known to his brothers. And he wept so loudly that the Egyptians heard him, and Pharaoh's household heard about it. Joseph said to his brothers, I am Joseph. Is my father still living? But his brothers were not able to answer him because they were terrified at his presence. Then Joseph said to his brothers, "Come close to me." When they had done so, he said, "I am your brother Joseph, the one you sold into Egypt. And now do not be distressed, and do not be angry with yourselves for selling me here, because it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you." Here's what he is saying. This is all part of God's story. Don't be angry with yourselves for what you've done. God used it. Chapter 50, verse 20 in New Living Translation says, "You intended to harm me, but God intended it all for good." Amen. You meant this for evil, but God used it for good. The brothers didn't know at the time. Joseph didn't know in prison or as a slave. God certainly didn't cause the brothers to sin by selling Joseph into slavery or lying to their father about his death. God didn't cause Potiphar's wife to sin by lusting after Joseph and then lying about an attack. But there it was. Here's what God does. He takes all those decisions, all those broken pieces, all those disappointments, and he says, "I can work with that." That's right. He takes all these pieces and accomplishes his purpose. It's for Joseph's good, and for the glory of God, he redeems. Amen. Ultimate view of God's sovereignty we can see in this. It's not to say that God causes all things. He causes all things to work together for the good of those who love him and are called according to his purpose. He can take anything, any piece, and he can use that for the good of his story. Joseph says, "God has redeemed this." Here is what I'm saying to you. Never give up on God redeeming your story. That's right. Never give up. He's the great Redeemer. He is who he is. Amen. This is what he does. It's my favorite thing about God. He can redeem anything. It's never too broken, never too busted, never too late. He can fix it. Amen. He takes the broken pieces and he turns it into something beautiful. That's right. This is the upper story the Bible is trying to tell us. Broken pieces are ultimately leading to the great Redeemer, Jesus, who redeemed the world from its sin. Joseph spent a long time as a slave and in prison, but God hadn't left him. God was at work the whole time. And now Joseph sees it. He sees it, so he's not angry with his brothers. It's easier in hindsight to see how God has worked and how he puts the pieces together. I was reflecting on this in my own life, thinking about how God has worked to bring me here. I love being a part of this church and what God is doing here, and I love being a servant and part of the leadership of this church, but I never could have predicted it or orchestrated it. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about my story from my viewpoint. I was basically an orphan. When I was young, I was dropped off at a church in Louisiana by someone on their way to commit themselves because I guess they weren't feeling too good about themselves at the time. My parents arrived on a mission trip and were hungry. A family at church invited them for some spaghetti. While they were there, I walked up to my mom and go, "Are you my mommy?" And that was history on that part. I moved to Texas. We moved to Oklahoma. And then we moved up here to Minnesota. During that time, I went to 8 different schools, K through 12, some in the same district, and a bonus 9th grade in there. It was 2 9th grades. But during this time period, I decided I wanted to be a pilot. That's what I really wanted to do. And so when school ended, I kind of wanted to get away from here. I was like, I want to be a pilot. So I joined the Air Force, right? That's where you go to be a pilot. Didn't really understand the whole have to be an officer to be a pilot thing yet, but I learned that lesson. So I did my time in the Air Force, got out of the Air Force, came home. I started job hopping. Job to job to job. I've had, I think the last count, 28 jobs in my life. I college hopped as well. I went to Century College for some general courses. I went to the Art Institute for graphic design and computer animation. I then went to Northwestern and got a degree in my business management. And then went to Metro State for my police certification to become a police officer. And then came the kids. I got the kids now. And that kind of changed the plans when Aubrey came about. And I became a stay-at-home dad. To now I'm the youth pastor and preaching in front of you. So I'm standing up in front of you now preaching because my parents were hungry for spaghetti. That's how God works, right? You're hungry for spaghetti, and there I am here preaching. I think one day in heaven, we're going to discover that there are all kinds of insignificant things that God used to shape our own personal stories. Because the Bible says in Romans 8:28, in all things God works for the good of those who love Him and are called according to His purpose. In all things. In good things, in bad things, in all things. In big things, in little things, He is in all things. In exciting things, in disappointing things, in all things. This is the promise from God. We don't get to choose our own adventure. We don't get to choose how we respond when disappointment inevitably lands in our life. If I were to read your story, how would it tell of you dealing with what your current chapter is? Maybe your current chapter of life is unemployed. Maybe a chapter of your story is titled divorce, abused, terminal. The disappointment will come. Our tendency is to become bitter, withdrawn, become harsh with everyone around us, hard at heart. But in the midst of the disappointment, God is still there. Amen. And when we love Him and when we are called according to His purpose, we can know that He is working things for the good. So how will you respond? All of us start off thinking our story will be written a certain way, but we never quite get it as we planned. We don't get to choose our own adventure. We don't know what the challenges we will face in life will be. We don't know what the hurt will be that we will have to handle in our lives. We don't know what suffering will come our way. But what we do know is, we know that in all things, God works for the good of those who love Him and are called according to His purpose. So right now, the word in your life may be disappointment, but God writes the last word in your story. The team is going to sing here a song here real quick, but we're going to offer an invitation today. So if you're experiencing disappointments in your life and want to experience God more, or just need to talk to someone about these disappointments, please, we're going to have people down front here just come and talk with us, and we'll go from there.